Ever have that awkward moment when you're writing your story and you realize the point of view character that you chose isn't really your protagonist? Hi, I'm XP Lovecat, a developmental editor for fiction, and today we're going to be talking about how to identify your protagonist. And this can be used either to determine who it is or to double check and make sure this is really the right person to tell your story. So why is choosing the right person so important for your story? This is going to be the person or the creature, depending on what kind of story you're writing, that moves the narrative forward. It's also the person who is the connection point emotionally for your readers, which is really important. See, events itself are neutral. We could have someone whose sister is coming to visit and their sister is their best friend. They haven't seen them for months because they're away at college, so they're super excited to see her and spend time with her. On the other hand, maybe a different protagonist, sister, they have a really strained relationship. And she thinks that when the sister comes to visit, it's just going to be fighting and trying to talk about how to get the brother involved in the family or whatever other drama is going on. So you can see in this situation, this event of the sister visiting is neutral, but depending on who your protagonist is the way that readers will be told how to react to your story. So this is a super important part of the process to make sure that you have the right person to tell your story. So how do we actually determine who's going to be our protagonist? Well, there's 3 things to consider. The first is who has the most at stake. So this essentially means if their goal is not reached, who has the most to lose? This makes sure that the reader is really connected to the story and has some sort of rooting for the protagonist, right? If there's someone that doesn't really have a lot to lose and it doesn't matter what happens, then we don't care as much. But if this protagonist has a lot to lose, we're really invested in the story and connected to the protagonist. Number 2, who has the most dramatic arc of change? So what I mean by that is every character has a character arc, particularly your protagonist, and this protagonist that you choose should have the most amount of transformation or change. This is generally a good place to look because it tells us a lot about the story and we get to grow and change with the character as we're reading the book. Number 3, who can highlight the message or theme of your book the best? Let's say we're writing a book about technology is evil. In this case, if we start with a protagonist that already believes technology is the worst thing and completely ignores it and tries to not have any of it in their life, this is not going to be very exciting because the character already believes the message that we are trying to show in the story. Whereas a protagonist who's addicted to their phone, constantly on technology, doesn't really have safety measures, and then something happens to that character that shows our message, this is going to be much more impactful than the first option. So keep in mind what your theme and message is actually going to be and ask yourself questions about if this protagonist is the right person for this message. I'm curious down in the comments, do you always know who your protagonist is going to be right away when you start your story, or have you ever struggled to figure it out? Let me know. I'd like to touch a little bit on multiple POV books, which are very common. And a lot of times people will say, well, if I have multiple POVs, then I have more than one protagonist. And that's not really true most of the time. Now, a note here, if you are just starting out writing your first book, I highly recommend that you stick to one POV. It gets pretty complicated really quickly when you add multiple perspectives. Let's talk about a really common example, which is in the romance genre. Generally, we will have both POVs of this romantic relationship. And it might be argued that both of these people are our protagonists. I'm going to give an example from a book that I just read, which is The Paradise Problem by Christina Lauren. Here we have the perspectives of both Anna and Liam, and we're rooting for this relationship throughout the story, which is generally the point of a romance genre book. But I would argue here that Liam is actually our protagonist. The whole story revolves around Liam's family and the dynamics there. And most importantly, he has the greater arc of change in the story. Throughout the novel, Liam learns the importance of honesty and how important it is to keep those he loves close to him. Whereas Anna's arc of change is not quite as dramatic or exciting. So in this situation, even though we have both points of view, Liam I've identified as the protagonist. Just keep that in mind if you're working on a multiple POV book. And for fun, when you're reading these kinds of books, try to identify the protagonist yourself and see what hints and clues you find in the book to help you identify that. Ideally, you're picking your protagonist at the beginning of this process. Sometimes things shift and change, and you might end up changing who your protagonist is. But if you want to have some tips on outlining, which is kind of where this protagonist stuff comes in, then check out my freebie on outlining below. And if you found this helpful, I would love it if you could like and subscribe so that YouTube knows exactly who my audience is and can help support these videos growing. Thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.